Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my round 5 game from the Luneberg Chess Festival. Now, if you followed the round 4 video, you know that I lost a tough game against a Ukrainian Grandmaster, and I really just got outplayed from pretty much the middle game onward, and I was hoping for just basically put up a better effort this time because that was a disappointing loss. My opponent in this one was another Grandmaster, this time from India, and his name was Sriram. He's in his early 40s and has been, representing India for many, many years. And, obviously India is now a very, very significant chess country and player on the world scene with so many of their young talents, really, really blossoming in this information age where there's just more access to material, more interest in the game, and so on. But Josh Sriram was one of the older guys on the block, you could say, that became a GM in India when it was really, really rare to do so. So kudos to him. I was white in this one, and I was trying to, again, essentially play a better game than before and to just get on the board in some sense and put some pressure on him. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So anyways, I'm with d4, which is typical for me, and Sriram played d5, and after knight f3, knight f6, and c4, Sriram played c6. And I'd noticed in the vast majority of his systems, he was usually going for Slavs or semi-Slavs. And I've normally, in this system, against c6, played the move e3. And there are many games I've played e3. And, I've had varied results with it. But, e3, e6 has been, a very topical semi-Slav position for almost really like 30 years now, when there's a lot of theory here in the Moran, as it's called, and lines after knight c3, knight bd7, bishop d3, takes, and b5. And these lines were featured heavily in many World Championship matches. The one that comes to mind for me, though, is the match between Anand and Kramnik, where Anand actually won 2 games with black in this particular variation after bishop d3, a6. So I didn't really necessarily want to go for this type of line today, and instead I actually played knight c3, which is extremely rare move for me because it actually keeps my options open and gives me the ability to develop the bishop outside of the pawn chain as opposed to keeping it on c1, which is typically the case when you play e3. Now, when you play knight c3, you're actually inviting certain lines of the Slav as well. So, here d takes c4 actually introduces the Dutch variation of the Slav, and the point here is that now b5 is a threat trying to protect the c4 pawn. So after a4, bishop f5, e3, e6, bishop takes c4 is quite a topical position in the Slav Dutch variation. But I've never played this setup in this particular system, and I thought it might be a really, really good surprise for Sriram that might have seen my e3 games. So that's why I actually played knight c3, and I think he was kind of thrown off guard because he thought for a little while and then actually played the move g6, which is not at all the most principled move in the position. Obviously, d takes e4, as I just showed, was an option, but also if you still want to play a semi-Slav, you should be going e6. And here, the sharpest lines in chess can come on the board after bishop g5 and h6, which is known as the anti-Moscow, after bishop h4, g5, bishop d3, d takes e4, e4, and b5. And the position is just a total mess. Basically, black holds on to this c4 pawn with b5, but white obviously has a nice center and can play against the weaknesses on the king side that were created by the g5 thrust. And these positions are devilishly complicated. And I think my opponent was not really into playing this type of battle today, or on this day rather. So he opted for a move that isn't going to be a sharp theoretical battle. He's kind of ceding the opening advantage, or at least the space to white. But he's saying, I just want to get a position into the middle game where I can pretty much outplay you later. And it's a pretty interesting decision, but it is somewhat of a concession to play g6 because this is not a move typical in these types of positions, particularly when the bishop can come outside of the pawn chain. Now, the funny thing is that if you play the e3 variation, and here, instead of like knight c3 and moving the bishop outside the chain, here g6 is actually a theoretical move, and it's known as the Schlechter Slav. And the point is that, you actually do fianchetto this bishop, and it's not such a huge deal because the bishop on c1 is actually caught behind its pawns. So it becomes pretty much a hybrid of the Grunfeld and the Slav. But one of the real issues for white is solving this bishop on c1. And black doesn't have to actually contend with the bishop outside of the chain. And, basically some play on this diagonal on the dark squares. But the way I played it, now after g6, my bishop is still available to get to f4. And so I actually went c takes d5, c takes d5, and bishop f4. And my idea here was that I'm essentially getting an exchange Slav type of structure, but with the bishop outside of the pawn chain and on the really active diagonal, and this bishop fianchettoed behind potentially my wall of pawns in the center. I thought this would ensure white a slight advantage in the symmetrical structure. So I felt pretty good here. I wasn't too sure whether bishop f4 right away made a lot of sense because now d takes c4 is actually an option, trying to hold on to the c4 pawn. But even here, I think white would have interesting play by just playing e4 and essentially saying, you know what, you have this pawn, but white has space. But I was less sure about the consequences of this type of setup. So that's why I took on d5 right away. So anyways, after bishop f4, knight c6 was played. That's one of the things that's kind of a downside of trading on d5 is that you actually give the knight the c6 square, which, it doesn't necessarily have. Typically, it winds up having to go to d7 if the pawns are still on c4 and c6. So that's well played. Note that knight b5 is not a possibility here yet because queen a5 check just forces the knight back to c3. So that would be a bad move. So anyways, after knight c6, I went e3, just continuing to develop. And now bishop g7 was played. And here already, I made a slight mistake and should probably play the move h3. And the reason for this is that I preserved my bishop on this long diagonal. The move that I made is a normal developing move, but it actually invites black to play the move knight h5. So I actually went bishop e2, but in this position, knight h5 is actually quite playable. And the point is that now my bishop doesn't get the opportunity to stay on this diagonal, and it's actually quite a typical idea in some London systems as well, when the bishop comes outside the chain, and black is actually controlling the e5 square with a knight or a pawn on d6, that you actually harass this bishop on f4 because if h3 hasn't been played, it can't stay there. And what winds up happening is you chase it around the horn, as I say, with bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, and g5. And, lo and behold, I did create, some potential light square weaknesses by forcing black to push the g-pawn. But all in all, my bishop would eventually land on g3, where it can be secured for a black knight. And this actually, I think, really gives black a decent position because he has the bishop pair, and he didn't have to do too much to get rid of it. And even playing the move e6 here, shores up the f5 square a little bit. And black's position is remarkably resilient, and now he has the long-term trumps in the form of the two bishops. So basically, inviting this type of maneuver was something that was kind of ill-advised. One other thing I want to point out is that after g5, there's this idea in the London system, and particularly when the bishop is chased around here, where you can try to move the knight away to uncover the bishop on e2, hitting the knight on h5. So a move like knight d2 is sometimes a possibility. But the reason that it's not very effective here is because the bishop is actually on e2, and there's actually this really nice resource for black here, knight f4. And the idea is that by moving it to f4, now if black, black still seeks to get the bishop pair with g takes h4, and if I retreat the bishop, there's actually knight takes g2 check, and then just darting back to h4. But actually that wouldn't work because, actually that would work. Knight takes g2 check, king f1, and even bishop h3, and this is a horrible position for white. But even there's some lines where white's already castled, and this knight f4 move is an idea. And the point is that the knight's also hitting the bishop on e2. So basically, black secures one of the bishops regardless with this knight f4 idea. And the point is that, if I take the knight on e4 with e takes f4, I really weaken my pawn in the center. And after g takes h4, black is actually for choice here because he could play along the g file, potentially the rook g8, and the pressure on the d4 is quite immense. And again, the two bishops in an open position is quite a serious deal. So those nuances actually make it not so attractive to play this knight d2 idea, trying to uncover the bishop on this diagonal. So yeah, pretty interesting position, but these lines tend to be a little bit more favorable for black if he's able to secure the bishop pair. So anyways, I did go bishop e2, and fortunately for me, white did not lose the bishop right away because black actually castled. But even here, knight h5 is actually a threat, and because it's a threat, I should have played the move h3. Again, now, if knight h5, I could just dart my bishop back to h2, and black has quite a decent position here. Or excuse me, white has a decent position here. One thing that I was concerned about was actually black playing the move queen b6, and I thought that black's actually quite fast getting pressure on the b2 pawn. But actually, I can indirectly defend it in quite a convenient way with the move a3. And the point is that queen takes b2 is actually a poisoned pawn that loses the queen because of knight a4. And this is actually a typical idea in certain lines in various openings, like the Najdorf, for instance, the bishop g5 Najdorf. There's some queen b6, queen takes b2 ideas, which sometimes are poisoned. And the point is that every square on the b file is actually covered by a white piece. So remarkably, the queen is just trapped. So basically, after a3, I indirectly defend the pawn. I can castle next. And then at some later juncture, I might consider playing b4 or knight a4 and playing on the queen side. So this would be a better way to go than what I did. Instead, I castled, and now Sriram actually decided to play knight h5, now taking full advantage of the fact that I still did not play h3. And I gave him a few tries to do it, and he finally does it. And unfortunately here, I'm going to part with my bishop pair because I can't keep it on this diagonal, as I've mentioned. And yeah, I mean, if I basically just need to try to create some type of weakness in black's camp before losing that bishop, because I obviously don't want to go e takes f4 and double my pawns on the f file and essentially have a weak d4 pawn. So because of that, I went bishop e5. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about this is, whenever the bishop is harassed and you can't retreat, you actually always have a choice between bishop e5 or bishop g5. And basically, I went bishop e5, but just to show you what bishop g5 would look like, it's very similar to some of the lines I showed before. There'd be h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and then knight takes, h takes. And essentially, these double pawns aren't so bad for white, but the issue is that the two bishops are a huge factor. And black having these pawns on h6 and g5 actually aren't really a target because it's not like white is playing along the h file. And so black's actually just slightly better here, in my opinion. And so I thought that, basically I didn't want to allow this expansion near my king because later g4 might actually be a move in the endgame, fixing my pawns on these dark squares. So in the short term, black would probably play e6, bishop d7, queen b6, rook c8. But long term, black could even consider e6, f5, and g4, and my knight could potentially be caught out on h4 and completely trapped. And this is something that I was kind of wary of. In fact, there was a recent rapid game in the Exchange Slav. It might have been a blitz game, actually, in the Exchange Slav between Pentala Harikrishna with white and Magnus Carlsen with black. And Carlsen actually had a structure similar to this where he actually played g4 and forced the black knight to h4, or the white knight to h4. And that knight actually never got back into the game and was pretty much trapped for a long, long time, and black went on to win a very, very nice endgame. So essentially, I didn't really want to entertain such structures, and I thought, inviting this h6 to g5 stuff would cause me problems in the endgame. So that's basically something I was thinking about. Again, that game was Hari Krishna versus Carlsen, and it was actually from the Tata Steel India event that was recently finished. So definitely check that out if you're curious about that structure as an exchange Slav. So basically, because of that, I actually decided to play bishop e5. And my idea here is, twofold. First of all, if you decide, I don't want to push f6, I want to play knight takes e5, this is actually not the best move, because after d takes e5, all of a sudden the d5 pawn is actually a target, and the natural move to defend it, e6, actually doesn't work. And this is actually quite a well-known idea with this concept, because now the knight actually can't return to f6, and so g4 actually traps the knight, and white would just win a piece. And note that e6 cut off the oxygen from the bishop controlling the g4 square. So basically, this type of position is a little bit unpleasant just because there's no natural way to defend e6. And so in a move like bishop e6 is actually quite ugly, because now white can actually make a move like knight d4. And here black still has the issue of the knight on h5 because g4 is a threat. But also now there's knight takes e6 as an idea, and even bishop takes h5. And so a position like this one where bishop takes e5, let's say knight e6, f e6, or even maybe not even knight e6, maybe bishop takes h5 first, g takes h5, and queen takes h5. This position is just better for white all of a sudden, because white has the better pawn structure and can get one of the bishops when he feels like. So this would be a position that would not be so hot for black. So basically, knight takes e5 is not such a great idea, and so now to secure the bishop, Sriram has to play f6. And at least here, after I drop my bishop back, and this actually happened, this exchange on g3 and h takes g3, at least white can say two things. First of all, this bishop now is locked behind this f pawn for the moment, and so that's not so great. And this diagonal is a little bit weaker than it was a move ago, because f6 opened the highway to the king. And so white has a little bit of play, you could say, on these light squares in the center of the board. But of course, black has the two bishops, and with proper defense, black should still actually retain all the long-term trumps and have good chances to play for something a little bit later. But I thought at least in the short term I might have a little something. So anyways, after h takes g3, black played bishop e6. This is actually a very good move, and a move I actually just overlooked. I thought in all these positions, Sriram would probably play pawn e6. And I thought, you know what? Yeah, this pawn is quite solid here, and, the light squares are covered. But I thought that this bishop on c8 now would be pretty passive, and I thought there would be some lines where I could just play immediately on the queen side with rook c1, because the natural way to develop the bishop now would probably be to b7, but all of a sudden there's sometimes some tactical problems with the knight being loose on c6. So there's some lines where I can go like queen a4, bishop b7, and sometimes there's tactics with knight takes d5, but there's also ideas of bishop a6, getting rid of these light squared bishops, and then kind of accentuating the fact that these light squares are a little bit sensitive in the center and on the queen side. And so I thought this would promise me really good chances in the short term, particularly with the bishop on g7 not really playing right now. So I thought, you know what, that would be kind of a promising position for me. But bishop e6 is really smart, because he's covering overprotecting the d5 pawn, and then he's going to put it on f7, where it can't really be harassed by any of white's pieces. Like if the bishop is on f7, I'm not actually attacking it, and it's doing a good defensive job. And the other thing here is that he very quickly connects his rooks, which is the one priority he should be keeping in mind in this setup, because I am going to, in the short term, try to develop some initiative on the queen side. So anyways, after bishop e6, I went rook c1 anyway, just trying to get something going there. It's typically a nice thing to start with rook c1, because now when I attack b7 later, essentially the b pawn won't be able to move because the c6 knight will be loose. So that's something that I wanted to kind of get in first. After rook c1, black played rook c8, good move, defending that knight. And here I played the move a3, but this move is just a little bit too slow. Again, I'm I lack the bishop pair. Black has the bishop pair, and I need to be a little bit faster with my initiative. And so a better move would have actually been queen b3, just playing this right away. And the point is I just challenge b7, and if knight a5, I actually can go queen b5. It's funny because actually this wound up happening just a little bit slower than I wanted, than it should have been, because after a3 and bishop f7, now I actually realized that b4 is actually not as effective as I thought it would be. My initial idea was to go b4 and to kind of, go knight a4, knight c5. But what I realized here is that black is already pretty close to connecting the rooks. And after a move like, let's say like queen d7, it's maybe not queen d7 because it runs into this pin, but a move that connects black's rooks is really going to give me some fits. So actually queen d6, for instance, actually does that quite effectively. And the point is that if knight b5 now and queen b8, the rooks are connected, black can kick away the knight on b5 with a6. And once black doubles on the c file, the issue with me playing b4 is going to show, because essentially what has happened is now I lack some security on this file, and so it's going to be hard to block it and shut it down, whereas with my pawn on b2, the knight on c3 is very secure. And so that's something that you kind of want to think about when you're pushing the b pawn in these types of structures, is whether you actually have the c file squares behind the b pawn that you thrust up the board, whether those squares are still secure. And basically here, it's quite clear that they're probably not, and it might actually accelerate black's play on the queen side at a later juncture once he gets in e6, moves the rook, and plays bishop f8. All of a sudden, these pawns could be targets. So, something to think about. So that's why actually I went queen b3 now, kind of recognizing that, you know what, b4 is probably not a good move. This is a slightly better way to get pressure on the pawns. Now queen d7 was played, defending the b7 pawn. An argument could have been made for a move like queen b6, but I think the reason that's actually not so good actually is because after queen takes, pawn takes, there's knight a4. And now you can see the b6 pawn is actually going to hang, so it doesn't quite work, even though on the face of it, it looks like a decent move. Yeah, there's also knight a5 as a potential move, and it's funny because this actually does wind up happening in some lines, but after knight a5, my idea was to go queen b4 and just challenge this knight anyway, or even queen b and even queen b5 is an option, but basically to keep the pressure on the b file. So anyways, after queen b3, black played queen d7, and now I went rook fd1. And this is another move that is just a little bit slow and is not really consistent with what my initiative on the queen side. I think my idea with rook fd1 was that I was covering the d4 pawn, overprotecting it, but really sort of dissuading the move e5 from happening. Because now, with my rook lined up against the d5 pawn as well, this would just blunder a pawn. So if e5, d takes, f takes, knight takes d5, and I'm just winning material. And I thought, okay, this should be fine for me. So it's just not really a great idea. But again, e5 doesn't have to be played, and this gives black, time to improve his position. So that's why rook fd1 was not so great. Instead, I could have played knight a4 right away. And the reason this would have been smart is because I'm taking advantage of the queen actually going to d7 to defend the b7 pawn. Because now I might actually incur a weakness on the b file, and that's pretty much what I've wanted. From to play b6 so that I can get in bishop a6 or something along those lines, where I can have play on the b and c files. If black's pawns stay on a7 and b7, I pretty much have no target. So if black is able to successfully defend things and keep these pawns there, black will be better because he'll slowly start to consolidate with e6, rook fd8, bishop f8, and so on. So I really have to be quite alert and fast with my play, and rook fd1 kind of missed that mark. Anyways, after rook fd1, rook fd8 was played, and now I went knight a4. So you can see I'm pretty much like one move behind in terms of the plans that I've been trying to execute. It's not the first time in this game. We saw h3 earlier, would have been a little bit better to preserve my bishop. We saw queen b3 would have been a little bit better a move earlier before a3. And now we see knight a4 would have been better before rook fd1, or instead of rook fd1. But I'm just one step behind, it seems, in a lot of these lines. And it hasn't hurt me yet, but it's not great. It's not great that I'm missing the timing of some of these ideas, because I could have gotten it a move earlier. Now, here it is still a good move, because again, knight c5 is a legitimate idea, and it's quite annoying for black to deal with, because again, if b6, then I have bishop a6. So actually, knight a5 was played, challenging my queen, but now I actually just stepped up with queen b4, and I'm attacking the knight on a5, and I'm renewing the threat of knight c5. Knight c6 back was played, and I wasn't really intent on having a draw with queen b3, so I actually went queen b5 now and creeped up a little bit further. And now you can see again, knight c5 is a threat. Black now actually went b6, and this actually made me very happy, because all of a sudden these light squares are a little bit soft or sensitive on the queen side, and it gives me the much needed targets I needed to get some type of play on that side of the board. Instead, a much better move would have been rook c7. And the reason for it is, again, you just really don't want to create any weaknesses on the queen side, and if you consolidate, you have the better position. And the point is, now if I go knight c5, queen c8 is a move protecting the b7 pawn, and again, not creating that target that I've been trying to create. And I think another thing to point out is a move like knight b7, which you might say, oh, doesn't this win a pawn on the queen side because of the knight hanging? Well, the issue here is that after like rook takes b7 and queen takes e6, queen takes e6, rook takes e6, my pawn on b2 is actually hanging, and this position is just better for black because, you know, we've traded pawns and black has the two bishops still. So, yeah, this is a little bit strange looking at first, playing rook c7 and queen c8, but it's very, very precise and much better than what my opponent did. Because now after b6, now I went knight c3, and you can see now that my knight has done its job provoking this weakness with b6, and now I'm going to play on these light squares on the queen side. So now black actually played knight a5, but this actually kind of accelerates my plan, because now I'm happy to trade queens and actually go bishop a6. And the issue here is that black is now not able to double on the c-file because the rook is not secure on the square. So after rook c d8 was played, now I actually went knight b5, and all of a sudden I have full control over the c-file, and my knight and bishop dominate the entry squares for the black rook. So a real problem for black here, and now white is actually quite a bit better. Now, in this position, actually, I could have played more directly. The computer was actually pointing out that b4 is a move. I didn't really want to push these pawns too quickly because, again, I thought of the bishop shifting around to f8 and maybe these pawns being targets. And again, when I play b4, my knight on c3 is less secure than it is when it's on b2. So I actually thought knight c4 would be a little bit annoying. But here I actually have the move knight takes d5, taking advantage of the fact that this knight is really loose and the d pawn was the only thing covering it. And this is the hard thing, because bishop takes d5, bishop takes c4. It's pretty clear this one would just be, much, much better for white, probably just winning, because I'm getting rid of one of black's bishops and the remaining one is actually out of the game for quite some time. So it'll give me counterplay to basically encroach in the position with my extra pawn. But what I missed here with this knight takes d5 and b4 idea is that actually after knight takes a3, it appears that, this position is just fine for black because my knight on d5 is hanging and the material is still equal. But remarkably, the point is that after knight takes e7 check, I now jettison my knight for another pawn. And after rook takes e7, rook d3, actually the knight on a3 is actually just trapped. There are no squares it can go to where it's not not going to be lost. And so white actually remains a pawn up with a nice edge. So this was actually why this line's actually possible. Although I should say here, white's not winning. Black still is going to have some play. The bishop can still shift over to f8, and there's still, quite a bit of work to do. So it's not like this is completely winning, but it's a very, very legitimate option here, and something that, I didn't even consider because I missed that the knight would be trapped on a3. So anyways, instead, I went knight b5, and I thought, this is actually a pretty good move. I felt good here. I'm controlling the one open file, and I thought if I double and infiltrate, the a7 pawn will be a real target. Black now went e5, understanding the gravity of the situation and trying to get some counterplay in the center, and this is actually a really sensible move. I actually now went rook c3, just ignoring this tension on e5. What I really wanted to do initially was to take on e5 and go like knight g5, but I didn't think this would be so wise because now the bishop could be opened up on this diagonal, and it just didn't seem to be very correct to me. So I thought it's better to keep the bishop shut down on g7, and that's why rook c3 made a lot of sense. The nice thing is I wanted double rooks, and I also like rook c3 because it stops the knight from coming to b3 and keeps it the safest distance away, 2 diagonals away from the knight on a5, so it can't be harassed for some time. After rook c3, black actually went e4, shutting down the center, but a much better move, and a move that really, is tough for humans to fully understand, but or actually play and then execute, but the thing that the computers understand really well is actually knight c4. And the idea with knight c4 is actually just to provoke the b pawn forward to weaken my control on the c file and also make it a target. And remarkably here, after b3, which is the natural move and the move you pretty much want to play to, assume control of the c file, black can actually go knight a5 back. And the argument here is that the b pawn is now less secure on b3 than it was on b2. And it just makes it a little bit difficult for white to infiltrate because it has to be worried about that b pawn. And it's just a very, very smart maneuver that, again, like computers actually do these types of things quite a bit to kind of create a weakness and then go back. But it's difficult for a human to, basically retreat, like hit something and then retreat and say like this was worth the transaction. So I think it's a pretty interesting move, interesting concept. Instead, e4 was played, and after e4 I went knight d2, and again I have pretty good control here in the position, and I'm about to double rooks and seize the initiative completely. Black now went bishop f8, shifting that bishop over to the queen side. That was definitely always going to be something he needed to try and do to get some counterplay. And now I went rook dc1, and I'm nearly ready now to play rook c7 and pretty much just take the queen side. I mean, if I get in rook c7 and take on a7, that's pretty much the ball game. And so, black has to be very, very alert here. And black actually played knight c4, but this is actually not a good move. Now, the idea here is that b3 is not even a possibility anymore because the pawn on a3 is hanging. So I pretty much need to deal with the knight on c4 by taking it. The other thing is my knight on d2 is hanging, so of course I have to, address that as well. But the point is that actually after knight takes c4 and d takes c4, which I played, the issue here is that black still has not been able to assume control of the c file in any way or contest it. And in the interim, I can try to build up pressure on the c4 pawn. For now, the bishop is holding on to it. I didn't want to give up the exchange to secure that pawn. But yeah, I mean, it's still like a position where basically if I'm able to get my bishop to take that pawn, I'm basically just going to be nearly winning. I should point out, though, that rook takes c4, bishop takes c4, and rook takes e4 is actually a position I don't believe to be even a little bit worse for white because, again, black actually cannot assume any, control of the c file, and so, having this level of control, I don't believe I can be worse. But again, I don't believe that this is like better for white either because, my pieces are a little bit, oops, excuse me, I flipped the board by mistake. My pieces are a little bit tangled here. So my knight and bishop are stopping black's rooks from infiltrating, but I can't begin to win the game if my knight and bishop stay there. So anyways, after d takes c4, I actually went rook 3 c2, and this is actually the best move and is really clever because now I'm actually trying to bring my knight back to c3 so I can attack the e4 pawn and then also train on the c4 pawn. And black's actually in huge trouble here. Black played f5, protecting that e4 pawn before I went knight c3. And now I went knight c3 anyway. And basically my idea is just to, essentially team up on the c4 pawn. And so if I get my knight out the way, then the c4 pawn should drop, because black actually can't get 3 defenders over to the c4 pawn because the bishop's controlling the c8 square. So now rook b8 was played, and this is actually a decent attempt to try and thwart my plan, because now if I move my knight away, then b5 reinforces the c4 pawn and actually threatens to trap my bishop with rook b6. So first I played the move bishop b5. And this is also a really nice move because now I stop b5, I still retain control of this diagonal, and I hit the rook on d7 with tempo. Now rook c7 was played, and here is actually the critical position, or one of the critical positions of the game, because I've done so well to kind of, put this pressure on my rooks, on the black rooks, and essentially build up the pressure to attack the c4 pawn. But I have to be very precise with what I do next with my knight. And unfortunately here I was not. Why don't you pause the video and try to figure out which move you would make with the white knight to try and attack the c4 pawn. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and weigh the consequences of the next move. The best move in this position is actually knight e2. And unfortunately, I did not play this, but it's hugely important. And the point is that now if, first of all, if rook bc8 now, I can actually go bishop a6. And that's a very important detail because essentially with, now with bishop a6, the rook has to move away again. And essentially I could take here, and if you try to pin me again, I could take on f7 with check, picking up material. So that's actually why king g7 after knight e2 is pretty much the only move that is actually playable. Because now if I take the pawn, it appears that there's a pin on c8. But the point is that I could play rook 2 c3, and this is the really key detail, is now I'm actually going to win the pawn on c4, but I don't have to trade all my rooks to do so. And this is actually very important because endgames where I'm just a pawn up, but black has the 2 bishops, are kind of tricky to win. If I just have this extra d pawn, it's very important to keep one pair of rooks on the board. And so now if rook ac8 again, I can play bishop a6 hitting this rook. And if the rook moves, let's say to b8, now I take on c4. And the point is, if we do this pin again, now I can take on f7. And after rook takes c3, I don't have to trade all my rooks. I can go knight takes c3. And this is just very important because now after king takes f7, I've kept my rook on the board, and this makes it much, much easier to convert this position. Already, I can just go like king f1, king e2, king d2, bring my king to the queen side, and start pushing, and just using the rook to kind of make hay in the position would be very helpful. So essentially, that was the key thing, was to go knight e2 and then rook 2 c3 to kind of consolidate the position after king g7. Unfortunately, I played the move knight d1, and this is a terrible, terrible mistake because now after black plays king g7, I'm actually not really getting the ideal circumstances to win the c4 pawn. Now if I take on c4, black had played rook c8, and now because of this pin, bishop b3 is the only reasonable move, and after all the rooks come off the board, this position is probably closer to a draw than it is to a win, simply because these bishops offer a lot of compensation for the lost pawn, and in many circumstances, black may have the opportunity to trade his light squared bishop for the knight on d1, and that would just be a pretty clear draw with the opposite colored bishop position just a pawn up. And so this is why knight d1 is not very good. And once I realized this, I was just so annoyed with myself because it's actually a position where I was so close to just converting, and I just got careless. After knight d1 and king g7, now I didn't actually go for the pawn because I realized that the position was probably not winning, and I tried to, play in another way, and I went for the move a4. And this is a move that, basically tries to fix the pawns on the light squares, the black pawns on the fix the black pawns on the dark squares, and essentially, get some more light square control on the queen side, and hope that I can kind of secure the pawn later. But you can see here that this is not the ideal circumstance to do this type of maneuver, considering I had an opportunity to just win the pawn cleanly. Actually, a better move instead of a4 in this position would have actually been rook c3 now. And the point is, even here, I can now play rook c3 and then bishop takes c4 and again, keep a pair of rooks on the board. If bishop d6, I could trade. And then if takes, I've successfully kept a pair of rooks on the board. And if bishop takes c8, or if bishop takes c4, rook c8, I can again take here, and then after exchange, play knight takes and still keep a rook on the board. And actually, even in these positions, now that I've actually managed to get rid of one of the bishops, these positions actually are more promising for white than in positions where black just has the bishop pair, because I can start to undermine in various ways. For instance, g4 here is also a very interesting move, getting rid of my double pawn and now, making basically forcing an exchange on f5, where I might have some real chances in this type of ending because these pawns are pretty weak. So, yeah, it's not like it's at the end of the world now, actually, if I get rid of all the rooks, if black only has one bishop. But the point is, keeping the rooks on the board does help my task immensely. And again, the key move is to play rook to c3 before taking the pawn on c4. Instead, after a4 now, black actually went bishop b4, and this really killed me because now essentially I can never play rook to c3 because this bishop is just controlling the dark squares. And this has just drastically changed the evaluation of the position. Now, I could still play bishop takes c4, and it turns out that this is actually quite an effective move, but I didn't. The line could go rook bc8, bishop d3, rook takes, bishop takes, and obviously I'm still a pawn up here, but again, with the two bishops, very difficult to win, and probably a draw with best play. So instead, I actually went knight c3, trying to now entertain knight a2 as an idea. But again, I've kind of botched this. Again, not to have won this pawn and now to give black all this counterplay, I've certainly botched it. Black played h5, which is a really excellent move, basically taking more space on the king side and really stopping this g4 idea, which I showed a few moves ago as a potential idea in the endgame to undermine black's pawn chain, and particularly the pawn on e4. So now it's not even a possibility, and actually this is a really smart decision by Sriram to just take this away. I know it went knight a2 challenging the bishop on b4, but now the bishop just went to d6, and again, the same problems arise as before, where I have huge issues on with taking the pawn on c4. And actually, in many of these variations, I can't even do it because the bishop is now hitting the knight on a2. So now I actually went bishop a6, trying to essentially just stop rook b8 for now, and trying to reposition my knight maybe to b5 again. But black just went king f6 and continued to improve. And you could see in the last, basically 6 or 7 moves, I haven't made much progress in securing the c4 pawn and basically thrown away my advantage. I went rook c3 now, finally, with my rook protected on c3. I'm actually threatening the pawn on c4, but this is actually several moves too late. Black now went bishop e8, which is a great move, just challenging the pawn on a4, and it's just a new issue that I have in the position where essentially, the pawn on a4 is just a serious target. And one of the huge issues is that, I went bishop b5, but rook takes c4 in some positions actually just runs into bishop f7. And you can see how the knight on a2 is quite unfortunately placed. And after rook c6, black can just go king e7 now. And you can just see how much black has improved his position in the past 5 or 6 moves. Taking the space on the king side, getting his king moving towards the center, getting the 2 bishops open, that now having the pawn deficit is actually not as big a deal as it was before. After bishop e8, I went bishop b5 now, and this essentially, again, it's just admitting my mistakes, because now I'm basically giving up my bishop and admitting that the c4 pawn stays on the board. And after bishop takes d5, bishop takes b5, and a takes b5, and rook bc8, the pawn is actually firmly defended. And my knight on a2 is a pretty pathetic piece right now. But I thought that, in his time pressure, my opponent was in some time trouble. I thought that maybe I might have some practical chances, so I continued to play and tried to loosen the screws a little bit. But you can see now I can't attack c4 again anytime soon. My knight is not close to getting to d2, and even if it was, there's always bishop b4 as an idea. So I really have to come up with a new plan, and I thought the new target is actually the pawn on a7, which is a fixed weakness because of my pawn on b5. So now I went rook c2, king e6, king f1, king d5, king e2, king e6. He's kind of just shuffling, trying to make the time control. And now rook a1. And my idea here is now I'm going to try and press against the a7 pawn. Black went rook a8. I went knight c3. And now bishop b4 is played. I think this is a good move. Essentially putting the bishop on a5 and shutting down the counterplay on that file can be effective. And in some lines, actually, bishop takes c3 is actually just a reasonable move as well. As long as the king is near the center, it's hard to imagine the d-pawn being a serious factor, even though it's a protected pass pawn. After rook a4, black actually took on c3, and this is a good decision because if you play bishop a5, there is some risk of the bishop being caught out on this square. For instance, if I play a move like knight b1 now, all of a sudden b4 is actually a threat because if you play a lazy move, let's say like g5, b4 actually wins a piece because en passant actually loses the rook on c7, which would be quite unfortunate. So you actually are kind of at risk with the bishop on a5, and then I might be able to attack the pawn enough times where I actually win material. So bishop takes c3 is a good choice. After bishop takes, I went rook takes. And part of the reason I did that is because after b takes c3, even though it appears that, I have a good pawn structure and I might have pressure on a7 and c4, both these points can be very easily defended. And I think after this just a position after rook b2, let's say king d5 and rook b2, there's just no way I can basically win either pawn because both of them are defended twice. So I thought I can't really make hay in this position at all, and so it's not really something I should go for. So that's why I went rook takes c3, just so that in some positions maybe b3 comes into play as an idea. And because of that, king d5 was played, and reinforcing the c4 pawn. And the point is now if I play b3, rook c8 is a reasonable move. Note that c takes b3, again, hangs the rook. And you might say, oh, b2, doesn't it queen? Isn't it the rooks can't come back? Well, I could play rook b4 and get behind the pawn that way. So after b3, rook a c8, and now if I trade everything, it's actually me that has the problem because this position would just be a winning pawn endgame for black because he just take the b5 pawn and then have two connected passers. So in this type of position, I'd actually have to trade one pair of pawns. It's one pair of rooks and then keep one rook on the board just to maintain a draw. So instead, I didn't play b3 and I went for rook ca3, trying to get pressure on a7. And after g5 was played, this is actually a really great move now, trying to get counterplay on the king side. I actually went rook a6. And my idea here is that rook takes b6 is kind of a threat because the a8 rook is hanging. Rook b7 was played, defending the b6 point. And now I went king d2, trying to just bring my king in towards the queen side and eye the c4 pawn and just consolidate my position a little bit on the queen side before going for anything. And black actually went f4, and this is excellent judgment by Sriram in this position, because essentially if black does nothing but kind of just, go back and forth the king, I would improve sufficiently where he couldn't hold c4 and a7 together. So again, now if it happened like this, if rook c7, I could just play rook takes b6, and if rook c8, I can go rook takes a7. So it's very important that black actually initiates counterplay with f4 before I'm able to get king c3 and rook a4 in. And the issue here, frankly, is that now black's actually threatening to just take on g3 and then get counterplay on the f file, and my rooks are actually really poorly positioned to deal with that play. So because of that, I'm actually kind of forced to take on f4 twice. And I thought here I have some reasonable chances because my rook on the third rank could now shift over to the king side if need be. But all of a sudden, it's black that's kind of taking over the initiative for a moment and basically slowing me down from my idea. So f4 was really, really well timed. Black now went king d4, which is another very, very interesting move, basically boxing my king in. And note that, again, I can't really harass the black king because, it's shielded very nicely by pawns. So it's actually a very, very good move. And after king d4, I now went rook h3, trying to shift my rook over to the king side and actually try to collect some of these pawns, because all of a sudden this king is actually very, very active on d4. Black played rook g8, and this is actually a mistake. Instead, rook f8 would have been a lot stronger, and the reason for that is that if I play a move like g3, well, rook f5 is extremely effective defending the h5 pawn, but also attacking b5. And this type of position is actually much, much better for black because I can't hold b5, and after b5 is hit, then b2 will be hit, and I'm in a purely defensive posture. Black would actually be very, very close to winning. So instead, I couldn't play g3. I'd have to take on h5. But now after rook takes f4, f2's loose, and again, this king is so active that I'm actually in real trouble. I'd have to go king e1 to defend that pawn. And now after rook b f7, you can see these rooks are crashing down, and I'm pretty much forced to come back with rook a1. Fortunately for me, after rook a1, rook d1 is actually a mate threat, so black has to contend with this, and rook f5 is the best way to do that. If you actually take on f2 now, you do give yourself the e3 square after rook d1 check, but after king e3, rook h3 check, and remarkably it's white that's winning because the king has to go to f4 and then he loses his rook on f2. So rook f5 would be the most precise move just to stop this rook d1 mate idea and give the king the fifth rank to escape on. And after rook takes f5, rook takes a7, we ultimately land in a line that is basically drawing for white by the hair on his chinny chin chin. Like, essentially my rook comes back, protects the b pawn, and I can come up and get some counterplay. And the position is drawing, but barely, and we could see a lot of black's moves were easier to play than white's. So this would have definitely been a very challenging line to navigate, and much better than the move that he played, which is rook g8. Because now after rook g8, I could play g3, and all of a sudden I'm threatening the pawn on h5, and he doesn't have anything to show for his forcing g3. It actually helped me consolidate my structure. Now black actually played rook h7 to defend that pawn, but for the moment he's just a little bit passive. And now I actually played the move rook a1, bringing my rook back. And my idea now was to actually go rook a h1 and just try to win the h5 pawn, because if I get these connected passers going, I thought I would all of a sudden be winning again. Sriram also kind of panicked here and was a little bit concerned about my rooks getting up on the h pawn. And he actually blundered here with e3 check. a better move would have been king c5. And the point is now you just get at the b5 pawn and you get your counterplay going on the queen side before I get my pawns rolling on the king side. And so after rook e1 now, that'd be better than going for the h pawn. King takes b5, rook takes e4, rook d8 check, king c2, and rook d3. Black has a ton of counterplay here. This rook can come behind to f3 and attack f2 and kind of challenge the f pawn. h4 becomes an idea to kind of break up my pawns a little bit. And again, of course, he can run his pawns with a5, king b4, b5, and it's actually very, very difficult to play this position for white. So very, very interesting position and more precise than e3 check. After e3 check, I just took the pawn, and I think his idea was king e4, and this is what he did, trying to, basically get his rook some counterplay in the d file, but also entertain king f3 as an idea, infiltrating. And so because of that, I actually went king e2 to keep the opposition, get my rook out of the harm's way of a check, and to make sure the king can't infiltrate. And all of a sudden, I'm a pawn up, and I have a 3 versus 1 on the king side, and it looks like I have a real decisive position. But now black tried his best chance, and it was the move h4. And I think this is basically, what he was pinning his hopes on, is that if I take the pawn on h4, then the rook comes down to g2 with check, and he runs rampant on the second rank, and the king can maybe come in and be a participant. And so I really was not keen on allowing the type of g takes h4 variation. And that's why I actually went for the move rook d1, willingly offering up the g3 pawn so he doesn't get to the second rank. Now I could, I could have also played actually a slightly more precise move, would have been the move rook a4. And I was calculating this for a long time and trying to make it work, but I just couldn't make one particular line work after rook c7. This was the line that was kind of bothering me. I was a little bit concerned that if I take an h4, rook g2 is an idea again. But actually, the point is here, I can actually go b3, and this is a move that I'd missed. And the point is that after king f5 and rook takes h4, I'm actually totally winning, because after c takes b3, there's e4 check, and if the king goes to g6, there's rook g6 check. And then I could trade these rooks and then play rook b4 and get behind the b pawn. And so actually king f6 is better, but now I actually have rook h6 check remarkably. And after king g7 now, I have rook c6. And the issue is that now these rooks come off the board. a5 is played to try and keep the b3 pawn alive for a moment. And after rook a3, I actually secure the b pawn. And remarkably, this type of endgame, 3 versus 2, with rooks on the board, is actually just totally winning. In part because if the rooks come off the board, it's also totally winning. One sample end line that I think really illustrates this is actually just king d3, a4, and rook c3. And the point is that if the rooks come off the board with rook takes, king takes, and b5, this position is actually totally winning. Remarkably, the 3 pawns that are connected and passed can actually go up the board without the support of a king. So essentially, what winds up happening is, white's kings can shuffle to kind of like waste a move if need be, and then push the pawn. So for instance, let's say king e7, e5, king e6. It would appear now that if I went for g5, this position is actually a draw, because now after king f5, well, it's actually not a draw, but it would appear so initially because it doesn't seem like I can push either of my pawns. But the point is that if I go king a3, I waste a tempo, and then after the king moves, now I can push again. And basically that ability to waste a tempo with king b4 and king a3 actually means these pawn endgames are just winning for me. And of course, if you can't trade the rooks, then my king just comes in and actually mops up these pawns quite efficiently. So yeah, this remarkably would just be a winning position, but I think the key move that I missed was, well, there are several moves in the variation. b3 I missed as a serious idea, and after king f, and after h takes g3, frankly, well, I just missed the fact that actually rook h5 is actually a mate threat on the spot and actually just wins, because rook e8 is the only move to stop that mate. If you go rook c5, I actually can go rook takes c4 check. And after rook takes c4, rook e5 is mate. And so rook e8 would be the only move to stop the mate. And then now I can actually take. I'll take with check with the rook. Rook takes, pawn takes. And again, the king is actually paralyzed. The rook is paralyzed on the e-file. And so g2 is really the only move to make hay. But now I can go rook g5 and actually just secure the g-pawn and the game. So very, very important variation with this b3 move that I just missed. Instead, I went rook d1, and after rook takes g3 now, I went rook d4 check. And this was my concept, to push the king back this way. But this is actually not as clean, because now after king f5, rook takes g3, h takes g3, and king f3, black actually has rook h2, getting some counterplay on the b pawn. And if I was able to trade the b pawn for the c pawn earlier, I would have had a clearly winning position, having two connected pass pawns versus these two pawns, and because basically I'd be able to give up my b pawn for the a pawn. So here I actually played rook d6. And part of the reason I went rook d6 is I actually saw the mating idea now, and you can see e4 is actually a mate threat. So the only move here to stop e4 mate is actually rook f2 check, and now I took on g3. And after rook takes b2, I actually went king f3 back. And I actually thought here that I would be winning. But basically the point is that black here has the move rook b3. And unfortunately, this only move keeps black in the game, because I can't, basically force this rook to come off the third rank, and I can't threaten mate with e4 check and attack the pawn at the same time. So I went rook c6 trying to do that, but now actually black just went rook c3, protecting the c pawn, and that's essentially the point. Is I can't threaten this mate with e4 mate and challenge the c pawn and force the rook into zugzwang. So I went rook c7, and now king e6 was played, and the king was freed. And again, the position is not 100% clear. I now, though, have a winning position with best play. I just need to be really precise, and unfortunately, I was not here. Why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out white to play and win. What is the winning plan in this position? All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what the winning plan is, what the winning move is here. It's not the move that I played. I played the move rook takes a7, and this move gives black a draw, remarkably. Instead, the move was actually king e4. And it's actually so logical if you think about it, keeping the opposition against the black king, not allowing it to advance further. And the point is that after king d6 now after rook c6 check, king d7, you just go f5. And the point is that, yeah, black is going to get the b5 pawn, but the point is that my connected passers are actually further advanced than black's connected passers, and this makes all the difference in the world. And I don't know why I didn't go for this line, because it's actually quite obvious that that's the case. I mean, I can go e6 now and rook d7 check, and I'm just way faster than the black pawns. But for some reason, I think there were some lines where I was worried about the rooks being traded, and I thought that with a 2-on-2, my king would have to head towards the queen side to stop those pawns, and then we'd be in like a mutual zugzwang where we can't actually push our pawns, and it's just a draw. But the point is the rooks just aren't coming off the board here, just totally winning. So a little bit disappointing to have missed this line, because if you look at it now, it's clear that white is going to be way faster, but I guess I just missed that during the game, and it's just consistent with the whole game where I'm just missing themes. I'm missing ideas when they're most effective, and unfortunately that was really the last chance I got, because after rook takes a7, black and rook b3, I went rook c7 back, but now king d5 is a very, very important move. And the difference in this variation is that the the c pawn stayed on the board. So the connected pass pawns that black has are now b6 and c4, as opposed to before where it was a7 and b6. And this c pawn is the furthest advanced pawn on the board. So for some reason, I've actually managed to allow black's pawn to be further along than mine, and that's huge. The other thing now is that my king on f3 is actually boxed out. Before with king e4, I was actually boxing out the black king, but now my king is boxed out. And to add insult to injury, my e3 pawn's actually pinned here. So I can't even advance that. So yeah, I totally botched this one. I went f5 now because what else? I just want to push my pawn. And now king e5 is played, and you can see that I can't support the pawn well enough because my king is actually boxed out of the center. I went king g4 anyway, trying to just defend the pawn like that, and black took on b5. Of course, you don't want to go rook takes e3 because this would actually run into this would run to rook e7, and this is actually losing all of a sudden because after king d4 in this rook trade, I queened first, and unfortunately for black, queen f4 check picks off the queen on c1. So you have to still be a little bit alert not to get into the losing endgame, but rook takes b5 is sufficient, and the point is that this king is in a good position to stop these pawns. I now went rook takes e4, trying to keep my two connected pass pawns, but the king is too active right now for this to matter. And now rook b1 is a very, very key move because now he can check me from behind, which prevents me from advancing my pawns. I went king g5, and now after rook g1 check, I went rook g4, trying to shield my king. And again, remarkably, the precision is still required here because if you trade on g4 and then go b5, now again, I'm actually winning because I can go king g5, b4, f6, b3, f7, b2, f8, check. And here, queen f6 check actually wins because you can't go to e4 because queen f5 skewers the king and queen again. And remarkably, if you go king d5, I can still go queen f5 check, and actually trading these queens takes me to a winning pawn endgame. So you still have to be a little bit precise, and of course my Grandmaster opponent was, and after rook g4 went rook f1. And this is the key move in the position because now f5 is actually hanging, and again, if I went e4, but if I go rook f4, he's just going to check back. And if the king is forced to the h file, my king is actually completely cut off, and this type of position is actually easily drawn for black. I also have to worry about some mating threats, but the point is that this pawn is going to be a really good distraction, and I actually think if the b pawn is off the board, it actually still might be a draw because my king's actually cut off, so it can't support the advance of the pawn. So anyways, because of that, after rook f1, I went e4. But now b5 is played, and you can see now that the b pawn is really fast and gets counterplay. And the issue is I can't advance my f pawn because he just takes it. I went king g6, trying to slowly go king g7 and bring my pawn off the board. But now b4 is played, and essentially the issue is even though I have connected pass pawns here, I have two problems. First of all, my rook needs to come around and stop the b pawn, and when my rook does move, then king takes e4 is a move. The other thing is that if I went around with my rook right away, the issue is that rook g1 check would force my king to the h file, and again, positions where my king is cut off is just not going to be good. So basically, those two things mean it's actually quite easily drawn. And after b4, rook g3, you notice I tried to stop the b pawn, but now rook f4 can be played, and this is actually quite effective. I was hoping that maybe he would play king takes e4, and then this position all of a sudden is not so clear because now I can actually go rook b3, and this position might actually be losing for black because... Okay, no, it's not. Actually, king e5 is a move here. But the point is that if you went rook takes f5, now I have rook takes b4 check, and I'm actually winning the rook on f5 because if king e5, there's rook b5 check. But yeah, if you don't fall for this, you're in great shape. And yeah, after rook g3, rook f4 is actually totally sufficient. He actually is going to win the e4 pawn with the rook, and yeah, just very, very decent move. I went king g7 now, trying to just push my pawn further, and I didn't want to run into, f6 with rook takes f6 with check, so that's why I went king g7. But now king takes e4 is a move, and the issue here is that now after f6, black can just go king d4, and in these positions, he's actually able to offer up the rook for the f pawn because he's managed to get his king close enough to the b pawn that he can protect it. So I went f7, king c4. Rook g6 was a last-ditch effort just to get my rook behind the f pawn, because if I do that, then he can't actually sack his rook for it. But he played b3 anyway, and I checked on c6, went king d4, and then went rook b6. What I realized here is that if I just go rook f6, well, he's going to queen anyway, and again, this is just a draw. So I, basically went here, then I queened, we exchanged, he went b2, and then I took on b2, and all the pieces are off the board, and so the game was a draw. Woo, that was a long one. Unfortunately, it did not end in my favor. Typically, the long games tend to go my way, but I unfortunately was just too imprecise in the critical moments, and there are quite a few of them where I had an opportunity to really either put the game away or, turn the tide seriously in my favor, and I just missed the mark. And that was just a consistent theme throughout this event. I was just not myself. My body was not cooperating as well. That happens quite a bit this over the course of this year, where I'm just not able to compete at the highest level because my body's kind of letting me down. Yeah, it is what it is. You just got to keep fighting and hope that the next round might be better than the previous one. So that was what I was trying to do. But I hope you got some lessons out of it. Maybe the rook end games were of intrigue to you. Perhaps some of the middle games positions were of intrigue to you, because they certainly were for me. So I definitely took a lot out of this game. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.